don't know.
Right.
I'm using that VR line. We are looking at 104. I kept that just because I knew we were going to have the discussion because it's getting a lot of play and we should just go to an income base. I know that the income tax, and I've told people, is the prime source of revenue for the general fund. And Julia is here.
Right.
Are they off?
No, they haven't started yet. So I may need to duck out.
Okay.
If
I know where Dawn is.
I think he's working for related stuff.
Okay, so John is not available. So anyway, I'm just trying to get a sense of what is, how much money, how many millionaires, what is in that top bracket. I think we know whoever's in it this year, 50% of them won't be in it next year. So anything to help us just start understanding what is up there, what, if anything, is possible.
Sure. So Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. There are two documents posted to the committee page under my name. And one of them is something that we all earlier, I think in January, maybe, we were walking through the 6 pillars in the context of an education income tax. But what I want to look at today actually does include, well, actually, we can kind of tailor this to what you want to talk about most.
Well, I'll leave it up to the committee. What?
Well, I can tell you what's in it, so we can you can pick it up maybe. So I did pull out 2 of the pillars relating to sustainability and reliability of the tax type, which is something that we did go through together. And the other one is it's labeled fairness. It has to do with who pays, vertical equity kind of questions.
The pillars of a good tax code.
Exactly. And then the last 2 sections that I have in this document here. The first one has to do with some elasticity questions that have come up during other just broader income tax discussions. It's based on 2 examples that have happened recently. And then the last thing is, I think maybe something else you're looking for. It's just comparing the number of people that are in certain income ranges and how much income tax they are currently liable for.
Okay.
So if you want, we can run through all of that, or based on your comments, it sounds like maybe the last 2 sections.
Just a question. For income, you're talking about individuals and individual tax brackets, but what about things like small businesses? How are there flexible ways to treat them for this kind of tax?
Well, so the way the bill is currently structured is that the brackets introduced are based on just AGI. So if you have a like an LLC or a partnership and you get income through a business ownership in that way, that goes into the calculation of what your AGI is. So that wouldn't explicitly be like not included or included. It's just kind of treated like how we treat that income.
But if you
in
have,
regular tax.
are employed by a regular corporation that you own, as opposed to an S corp, for example, it wouldn't be calculated that way.
Well, if it's like some S corps, but primarily C corps, they're paying based on the corporate income tax code in Vermont. This
just redid that.
Right, and this particular bill is just looking at individuals' AGI, so it doesn't have anything to do with corporate income tax.
No, I understand. I'm raising it because it was one of the questions that came up in the hearing that we had today on Vermont Retail Day, and people, some of the people who work for businesses were concerned about how corporate income tax would affect how we might change the income tax to deal with property and the adverse effect it might have on their businesses.
Okay.
So that's why I raised the question. And yes, I understand that they could be S corps, or they could be LLCs, but a lot of businesses aren't either, or they're partnerships or what have you. Partnerships that the income would pass through, but
Well, I mean, in the context of property, as you probably remember from when you redid the whole thing, the property footprint used to be a part of the calculation for allocating C corps profits to determine whether it was taxed.
And now it's theirs.
Now it's just purely sales,
Mhm.
nothing to do with
I remember
property
that.
footprint.
The couple are locally generated large corporations possibly sell more out of the lot than they do. I don't know about maple syrup, but I hear that's gonna be majorly impacted. I'm assuming it's Canadian maple syrup by the tax. I don't know if we care about that.
I don't really have an opinion on this because I don't know enough about it yet, so I'm waiting for that, but I do think part of our discussion should be the fact that property tax they're so visible to people, they're so visible to Vermonters, and they're so intimately tied to education that it can make our education system really vulnerable to whatever rhetoric is out there around property taxes, or just the mood of your average, voter. So I hope at some point we can, and I don't know exactly how to contextualize that, but it seems like it's an important point. So I hope we can talk about that.
I've always said if you added up
Well,
the
you-
interest you paid on your credit card, and had to pay it all at once, it would probably be worse than your property taxes. But because the same with your income tax, because it's deducted and you don't have to write a check once or twice a year, and a large check, you don't notice it as much. I remember when the last tax cut and jobs bill went through, what got taken out got reduced, like $3 to $5 a week. But then you didn't get anything back in April, and people were upset because they planned on that return to do something on April vacation with the kids or buying a lawnmower or whatever. So there is a perception thing that goes with this. This is paid, and at most 4 installments a year. The bill comes once and it's large. And
well, this is why, Madam Chair, it's ideal that we take this up 2 days before, 3 days before April 15th.
that is true. All things will be for next year. Or actually, these timelines we're looking at are 2 and 3 years out, so. But, take us forward.
Yes, well, I'll just ask Madam Chair, I sort of laid out the 4 sections. Do you want to go through all 4, or
Yeah,
would you
I
like?
think
Okay.
that would be good.
So the first 2 will hopefully look familiar. I know with everything going on, January feels like a long time ago. But so just sort of in a sort of high level context, whenever you're thinking about sort of broad structural questions of how to build your tax system, there's what our office likes to kind of harp on, these 6 pillars of a high quality tax system. So I have them listed for you here. And these are from something that we all discussed, like I said, in January. I kind of pulled out those first 2 sections because I think that generally with that whole presentation, I think that they're the one that I find to be most important.
Yeah.
So the first one has to do with the sustainability and reliability. And this is in the context of essentially that, income taxes are not quite as, they're more volatile, they can be more volatile than property income taxes. I think that, especially you look at, what's going on in the stock and bond markets right now. I've actually seen recently Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan both recently upgraded and received likelihood of a recession in the near term, which, when you have a recession, that affects people's income, right? Which then again has the knock-on effect of flowing through to the Vermont revenue picture.
But it also, where property taxes, except recently when we saw some major increases, and we have had the last Great Recession started with collapse in the housing market. Property values have stayed more stable. But it ties to the income tax, because if your income goes down, your ability to pay the property tax can fluctuate. And I think that's the tension that people are feeling. Their property values have been going up in general, at least residential property. Commercial, I think it's going the other way, or just flat. But the value of residential property has been going up. Income hasn't been going up anywhere near as quickly. And school costs have also been going up. And so I think those are the dynamics that we're feeling right now.
Yeah, and actually, you touch on something that's also somewhat important when comparing the two. So with the personal income taxes, we're sort of experiencing what revenues are going to be in real time. One of the things that I'm sure Julia appreciate when she's working on the Meals bill is that the tax base for property taxes is very stable. The town maintain the grand list. We know what the value of the property is going into the year, and there's no uncertainty of, okay, the market sort of bottoms out, or the market does furiously well, the economy does furiously well, and lots more people are working. So it does go both ways. I don't want to just highlight the negative swings it can take. And also, comparing, knowing what the tax base is versus, sort of experiencing in real time. When you also look at the property tax credit, that's the income based used to calculate that is a look back. So you'll already know what the person in the previous year had, brought in an income. But whereas with the personal income tax, it's sort of real time. You could get fired tomorrow, you could get a big raise, and that kind of changes your income outlook for the year, and also for the state.
We tried doing that. There was a true up. We sent you a bill or a check. It didn't work. Checks got spent on vacations, not on paying property taxes 2 months later. And this has been the compromises. Because you probably,
And even within the income tax, there are sort of different degrees of reliability in them. So, for example, you see down here about 70% of the personal income tax comes from withholding. That generally is one of the more stable sort of aspects of that tax day. But where you get into more volatile areas is kind of what you were talking about earlier, related to estimated payments. So if the stock market's doing really well and you're expecting some big capital gains, you'd be wanting to pay a little more so you don't have those penalties for underpayments going along. And on the other end, you sell a business, that's a big one-time event that can really spike your income for 1 year. So on an individual to individual basis, it can be a little jumpy, right? And because it's so jumpy and withholding doesn't fully capture, in 5 days, you should be filing your taxes. That's why we do sort of a full year reconciliation to sort of tie everything up together. Because just relying on sort of the stream doesn't give us that opportunity for a true up. And Tom and Jeff, they come up with the estimates for this twice a year. But you can see here that, despite anybody's best efforts, in any given year, we can be 9% above, 4% below forecast. So, the number is generally, close to where we expect it to be. But even within that, the income tax revenue does come in above and below, which I suppose can be a little bit difficult to square away with something like education expenses, where it's you're building up on a lot of certainties, right?
So just out of curiosity, again, I'm in the learning phase here, but if you were in a year where it was like minus 4.2. And let's create a world where we're using income tax to pay for education, how would you make up the difference?
So in a situation where you've replaced the homestead rate with a non-homestead, or sorry, with an income tax, the only real tool that you have to sort of close that gap if you're, have a surplus or, you're coming in below target would be to adjust that non-homestead rate, right? Because it's a funding, what's the better term for that? It's self-balancing dynamic with the education fund where you start with the expenses and then you build the revenue to match that.
But you can't do it, you can't do that in real time, because as you said, this is in real time, it's not a look back.
Yeah, I mean, it does, in a down year, you might have to look at the stabilization part of the fund to help balance things off. But in a good year where you're coming in above forecast, that's a surplus that's accruing to the ed fund, right? So it does work both ways, but
This
you're right.
is part of the discussion or frustration, especially during the Great Recession. We were still operating under the requirement that the general fund make a set payment to the ed fund, and it had an inflation in it. And they had to put at least that amount in every year with an inflator. When we were going through hard times, we were cutting everything else in the state budget. And schools are guaranteed the full amount they voted to spend. At the local level, towns are required, because they collect the taxes, they are required to pay the schools the full amount they've budgeted off the top. And then if there's been a crash in the housing market, which there was, the towns have to eat the difference. And that's been a source of tension that schools get to vote to spend whatever they want, and every other needy aspect and important aspect of the state absorbs the difference. We now have sales tax in, and when we put the sales tax in as a substitute for the general fund transfer, it is about as stable as an income tax, and it was producing about as much money as, so it was a whole harmless thing. Then we got the Wayside decision. Then, and this is all within a year or less, and then we had COVID, and we got all the federal stimulus, which people did what they were supposed to. They went out and bought things, and we got, I think it was $20 million more in sales tax revenue, which we missed, probably because we weren't sitting here with our staff. And so that money, that additional sales tax money went in and bought down the tax rates. Nobody, you don't buy a new washer and dryer every year, hopefully, or flat screen TV. And so the sales tax went back to a more normal level. And that has contributed to some of the increases in the tax rate, because we had it inflated with the federal funding that went in there, and we missed it. We didn't hold it in reserve. That just made it, aggravated the situation when the school costs went up significantly. But we do now have a less stable than the property tax revenue source And definitely less stable than the mandated general fund transfer in the ed fund. I should also tell you that half seriously, the transportation people would like our portion of the purchase and use tax back badly, because they are in real financial straits over there, and having thought I broke my axle hitting a pothole on Route 2 the other night. I have some sympathy for we need to start paying. And we don't have the money to make the federal match, and you know, it's in bad shape. And we do get a portion. It was a trade-off. Originally, I think we got part of the gas tax. And we added to the gas tax to help pay for Act 60. And then they were about the same amount of money, and all the gas tax went to transportation, and we got a part of the purchase and use. It was a simplicity trade. It was just easier to divide up the purchase and use because there's few of those transactions than dividing up the gas tax, which is lots of these smaller, much smaller transactions. So, but that has been with us in one iteration or the other since the beginning. But there is an argument to take it away. Haven't heard it more than wishful thinking, but it's out there. So, I don't know.
Yeah, so just two other things I wanted to quickly touch on to Senator Gould's question. The first one is, I think one way that might be somewhat helpful to compare it is that when thinking about the budget as a whole for the general fund, you know, from there, for that one, you're starting with what's the revenue picture and building up costs. So sort of the inverse relationship. And every year, as part of that process, you know, appropriations will also build out a contingent list to account for any of that volatility that occurs. So I don't know, maybe that's kind of a useful way to sort of compare it. And the other thing is about, to your question about the real-time adjustments and how that all happens. And he would be well served in hearing from the lawyer when he's available, but within the bill, I did see that there is an adjuster, and I hope I'm using the right word by calling it adjuster, that based on what the school budgets are, if they are above or below the allowable expense amount, then you do take what their rate is and then multiply it by that ratio. So account for if a school does want to spend more than what's allowable, their rates will be a little higher in that area. And then also if they're coming in below, their rates would also be a little lower. So that's some of those sort of like, and I would look at Julia to talk about sort of how that looks when you're building up a yield bill.
Yeah.
Because again, that's sort of a real-time calculation that has to be based on what are revenues looking like. And
But this, you know, what we're looking at now is the proposal that they're doing on the floor as we speak, is that we would go to a foundation formula, the towns would get that and spend it. And then they would have the ability to raise up to 10% in some kind of adjusted or bring them above that spending. The state is responsible for raising the money to put in. So we therefore would have the responsibility. And that was part of the problem with the old foundation. When time got tough, we didn't completely fund it. And so we are not completely covered. The schools are not. And it I guess, is a philosophical debate as to whether or not schools should be held harmless during economic bad times, or if they should share in the pain. And if they should, how much should they? And that question is going to remain with us, I think, no matter how we choose to fund it, either through a property tax where the base is more stable, but it's paid with people's income. So individuals have to make those painful decisions. Or do we go to another tax? And I don't think anyone suggested the sales tax yet. Income is our other big tax, and sales.
Yeah, so please don't ask me this question, but one
Okay.
question you could ask is, just how does, this type of proposal or any proposal about funding fit in with broader conversation about, education transformation? Again,
Yes.
please don't ask me.
No. We have
Okay.
the lawyer's troop coming in on Tuesday to help us walk through this. All right.
Yeah, Patrick, you tell us what your thoughts.
Yeah,
I work on personal and
If it-
corporate income.
it's not,
You're a smart guy.
not within your pay grade. We understand.
I like that.
Yeah.
So this is something that we've talked about, but on here is an example of what a recession could look like in terms of what personal income tax income revenues perform. So in 2008, we had the Great Recession. And if you were basically swapping out the homestead rate for purely income taxes, in that year, you would estimated shortfall of about 160 to 170 million dollars to the ed fund. And that's all of the non-property tax that's in there. 70 million of that would have been strictly from the income tax revenues. I think this is still current, but if the non-homestead tax would have had to make up that that difference, that would have been a 20 cent increase in the non-homestead rate to account for.
That includes your businesses, which were also impacted by a recession significantly, and would be your second homeowners and people living in apartments of various kinds. Those are the bigger groups. Okay.
So that's an example of the downside. But in recent years, we have seen 14% over performance in personal income in the general fund. I know this is structured a little bit differently, but just using that as a proxy, in those situations, those would be surpluses coming into the education.
But that's income tax as a whole. Those surpluses have been used to do other things in the general fund. I believe those unanticipated revenues is where we borrowed $70 million last year to buy down property tax rates. That's where some of the money to extend the general GA housing has come from. And the next year, they are being absorbed into the general fund budget to do other things. So, yeah, the question would be, what if we put, and that's what I'm trying to figure out is what would the income, how much of an income tax percentage increase would we have to put on income tax rates or on the higher income tax rates to fund education? What would that look like?
Yeah, and so in my reading of the bill, this is sort of introducing a standalone income tax based on AGI. So within in our normal tax code, you start with your AGI, right? But then you have then it runs through, standard deduction, personal exemptions, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
With this, it's just
Healthcare?
it's just based on AGI, sort of as like it's almost kind of like a surcharge in a way.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
that's what's,
So it's very similar and at the same time somewhat separated and siloed.
yes, but what's the percentage on that
My
surcharge?
my understanding is that the brackets and the rates that are currently in the bill are sort of placeholders.
Julie, I mean, we've got brackets and rates right now, and that money's being spent in the general fund. So to fund education, we're going to have to put an additional charge on some, if not all, and probably all brackets, since all are being charged. Do you know what that addition would look like?
Sure, Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. I'm not 100% the income tax guy, so I defer to Pat on all income tax things. That being said, staffing the education income tax working group from several years ago that you co-chaired. If you, and I know Senator Beck was on that as well. If you were to recall the structure that was contemplated in the income education tax working group and then put into the legislation was the reflection of an example bracket structure that was estimated based off of education spending in that year. So that was a couple of years ago. Education spending has since changed. So as have the adjustments that Pat was talking about. So those were placeholder brackets as sort of a first pass, but emphasis on the first pass.
Okay. Do you have a number? Or at some point, I think it would be helpful to see what that addition would look like.
So if I may, and then
Yeah.
I'll defer to Pat. I think that one of the big questions about the education income tax is the structure of how it corresponds with education spending. So thinking about a number or a surcharge and those estimates, if it's being contemplated in the context of the education transformation considerations that this committee has been talking about, what is the spending that the education income tax would be raising? And how would non-homestead be restructured? Would it be maintained? I guess there's a number of questions in terms of what piece of the pie would the education income tax be taking up, and in what ways would it be adjusted? Because the education funding conversations have been different this session than when the working group was working on it.
Yeah, it was. We were looking at the old structure. And this, we would set the foundation rate. I think the open question is the bill, they're off the floor. What happened? They what?
They're constant.
The caucusing. What are ways that we could, are there different ways other than property tax that we could fund part or all of that base funding? And income has been put out as a fairer way because it is more tied to present. Well, I think it goes without saying that it's pretty hard to hide a couple of acres of land, but a couple $100,000, there are accountants and financial advisors that it's easier to hide fiscal assets. Legally and legitimately, but it's easier to have them not be as visible as your house in 10 acres or whatever, so. But, so.
So I guess to think about maybe sort of scale, off the top of your head, homestead property tax revenue last year.
I wanted to pull it up because I don't want to testify to a number. I've had too many numbers in my head in the last.
600.
Yeah, you're supposed to be
600.
getting a rental
So-
today.
Yeah.
No numbers.
So it's in last year, about 600 million was collected on the
well,
homestead
that's-
rate. To give you a sense of like scale,
And it's important to keep in mind the homestead, either gross homestead or net homestead when netting out the property tax credit.
so it's like net, that's the net amount.
Oh.
So to give you a sense of scale, this year we're forecasted to bring in about 1.3 billion in personal income taxes. So the structure would essentially be having to raise about 50% more in personal income taxes than we're currently doing.
Okay. So if we did it equally across the board, you would see a similar increase in your bill.
Well, there are the pound to pound adjustments that are built
Yeah.
into the language here, so it wouldn't be uniform, just as changes in property taxes are not uniform down to
Okay.
district to district, but just to give, like, you asked, what's the number?
Yeah,
Just based on sort of our current structure, you need about half again as much revenue from income that we currently collect.
and that would be essentially from everyone. Yeah, okay.
So to just keep moving, I have a couple of graphics just to show you how sort of the quote unquote smoothness of these two tax types differ. For personal income, you see in downtimes, you do get sort of a quick, sharp drop when there's a recession, for example. However, outside of that, you do see generally consistent growth in this tax type over time. As incomes grow over time, so does the taxes that you owe. So just to look at that and compare it to something like the property taxes that are collected, this one, the slope is not as well. It's maybe hard to, the scales are different, so I don't know if I can compare steepness of slope, but you see that it's generally because you're raising the amount that you need by setting those yields, regardless of what's going on in the economy, you do sort of have that sort of more smooth curve here.
And that's what we saw, and even though people still went into sticker shock when they opened their tax bill. We didn't have a real problem until we saw that steep increase that went up, and that correlated with a steep increase in school spending.
And healthcare costs.
Well, that was my next thing. I'm looking at this and saying, gee, that looks like some of the healthcare things we're seeing down hall. And but that we're trying to get it down in hall. But at the same time, that's spiking, people's health insurance costs are spiking along with the school's health insurance cost. So and we did see inflation. But
And so the inflation's a good thing to point out, because I don't want to suggest that property taxes are immune to what's happening in the broader economy. Because, for example, if we look at sales tax here, this is one of the non-property revenue sources that are in the fund. And if this, some rooms, some of those other taxes in there do take a hit, that burden does then fall on the property taxes, and sort of filling that gap in terms of revenue.
Patrick, is that dip there kind of because of the ESSER funds, the federal monies? Would that have smoothed it out if we didn't have those ESSER funds come in there?
On this.
On the property tax, yeah, like that 22 to 23.
Julie's nodding her head.
Yeah,
Julie's not.
is Julie? Yeah.
Yeah, so, yes. And, you also saw that steep increase in sales and use tax.
Mhm.
So you had the additional education fund surplus. So
Yeah.
to Pat's point about trickling in of pieces in the economy impacting the property tax collections, you didn't even raise much on property tax because you had surplus and federal money.
That's, okay.
So here I just want to highlight sort of how the general breakdown of tax type in terms of how the state funds itself shakes out. You know, this is based on the 10-year tax study, when this sort of level of detail was last looked at. You know, but you know, at the time, and it's probably about the same now, but consumption taxes, so that includes sales and use, but also the somewhat like gas tax. So it's not all education fund stuff. But it's about a third of state budget, property again, about another third, income tax about a quarter, and then the remainder being sort of fees and other miscellaneous revenue types. So like within that, you see essentially three pegs of the stool, relatively balanced here. If you were to purely replace the non-homestead with an income tax, you can see in the second chart down there how that dynamic shifts. Property would be less than a fifth, based on this is modeled based on what happened in 2015. So if you were to do that, based on what happened in that year, consumption's still the same, but you have income coming up to over a third, total. And again, I'll mention, just like in the consumption, they included things like sales and use and gas. That income there includes things like corporate income as well. So it's not just purely personal income that's in that bucket there.
There's corporate, and that's state spending overall.
That was, well, that wouldn't be state spending purely because this isn't accounted for federal funds. This is just state revenue.
Yeah, okay, no, but I mean, you're looking at the entire state revenue, kind of what, not specifically the education fund.
No, this is
would be-
total, yeah.
Yeah, total.
Yeah, this is that year was 3.6 billion. So obviously the budget of last year was larger than that. So yeah, this is just sort of highlighting how that dynamic shifts a little bit when you replace those two tax types. And again, so the property tax there, that's still there, that 17%, that would just be the non-homestead.
Okay.
And actually, this slide here speaks to a point you were making a little earlier in that property values and income don't grow at the same rates. You know, the yields in uniform non-homestead rate ensures that the revenue would be enough to cover any difference in how things are growing on the expense versus revenue side. But then as just an example to show how they change from year to year, personal income tax from 2005 to 2004 grew at an annualized rate of about 4.9%. Whereas total ed fund uses were growing at about 4%. So over that same time period, just showing that they do grow at different rates. And, you know, once you set the rates at a certain point, you might realize that we're collecting too much compared to the growth in the ed fund, or collecting too little when you increase them. So it is something that ultimately you likely would need to be revisiting at some point because they don't grow at consistent at the same rate.
I mean, this year we have what, $42 million that came in as surplus for everything that was estimated last year. And that was used when you did the calculation for the December 1st letter. That was taken off. Yeah, that was zeroed out against school spending. And then the calculation for the increase went in. So that's a regular occurrence because nothing grows at the same, but as long as they stay at relatively the same rate. The pain hit, I think, when
COVID.
school budgets, for whatever reason, went up 18. They're up over 5 this year, which in the past would have been a big increase. They went pretty, the line, they went pretty steadily, and we aren't out far enough to see if they're gonna level off at this point. Okay. Any more questions? Once you did not vote for House bill, what's without the end of the day?
So I do want to be cognizant of time as well.
Okay, yeah,
And I know that there are other people hoping to testify. I've
Yeah.
got a couple more sections.
Okay.
The last two are much shorter. So the other thing that from the presentation we had talked about previously, one of the pillars is called fairness and how you evaluate what fairness is. The lens to sort of look at is, one is vertical equity versus horizontal equity. So with vertical, it's your greater ability to pay. It means that you end up paying more taxes. The personal income tax structure is structured like this. You'll see a chart in just a moment where it shows sort of effective tax rates and how that changes as your income changes. And so Vermont in the income tax code is very progressive. I think in the most recent ITEP scoring, we were the was it phrase 49th least regressive state, basically second most progressive tax code. And so, in 2022, that was the year when the child tax credit came into play. That's just again another example of how progressivity in this sector has changed over time. But even when talking about what your ability to pay and that meaning that you should pay more tax, how do you sort of define that? And how much do assets that you own factor into that? Like how much do assets matter? Should we treat housing different than assets? When you're talking about wealth, typically what you always hear is that for the majority of Americans, the vast majority of their family wealth is in their home, right? And how much should that be tied to their most important asset to them financially, and how should that factor into what their ability to pay should look like? And again, that's a question for you all. It's not a question for me. There's examples of looking at the value of assets being tied to how much should be paid. The estate tax or the property transfer tax. Those are based on the value of the asset. And not tied to what your income is.
Right. At that point in time.
Right. And even when we talk about what someone's ability to pay is, we talked about this already, there's a lot of churn at year to year in terms of who are those really high earners in the state. There are some people who show up there year to year, but Jake might have an actual number on this, but there is a large percentage of people that sort of sit right around. Some years they're in that top percentile, sometimes they're just below of the highest income people in the state. And a lot of what can influence that is, like I mentioned earlier, is the business really can create a 1-year spike in their income. So the other lens that you can look through is horizontal equity. Two taxpayers in similar circumstances should be paying the same taxes. And then again, it's just a question for you all. How do you define what similar circumstances are? Two individuals both make $50,000, but one lives in a $150,000 house, while the other one lives in a $400,000 house. In this instance, they have the same income. One has a much higher value asset than the other person. How does that factor into your thinking about who should be paying more or less or the same in taxes, right? And so this is something we also looked at last year. I just want to bring this up again to highlight that point that wealth does not always directly translate to income. So in this top little section here, it's looking at the just top 1% of wealth holders in the nation. But then it's showing you that in the like 4% of the top 1% of wealth holders actually are below the median in terms of income. So that's
So they own a lot of land or
they own a lot of assets and are not showing a lot of income.
income, so they're not drawing down the assets, they're not taking the value out of it, okay.
So for some of those very high wealth individuals, their incomes could look quite differently. It's just what I want to highlight here. Coming back to the question about the progressivity of Vermont's current tax system, this is what like your average or your effective tax rates look like as your income is different. And you can see that Vermont current system, it's not until you get to about $25,000 worth of income where your effective tax rate isn't negative, meaning that you're getting more money back from the state than you're paying in taxes. And I wish I had inserted it here, but there's another chart all the way at the end of this that shows you how the picture of who pays the majority of taxes looks when you go up and down the spectrum. But a lot of that is borne by the fact that as your income is higher, the way that the state's structured is progressive code. That's a question of more ability to pay, and Vermont is showing that as your ability to pay in terms of income you're reporting, we think you should pay more. And this table probably would look familiar to you. This is looking at the progressivity of the property tax bill right now. You can see that in these lower income groups, you're actually showing that the average effective tax rate on their property taxes goes down as their income goes up. So that's a kind of the opposite of what we see in this slide here. It's the exact opposite. However, when we overlay the personal income taxes under the current code, you can see that does change the picture. It is not as slanted, or the curvature isn't as steep in that line graph that we just looked at. But it does mean that, generally speaking, as your income over on this side goes up, your effective tax rate, when we combine your income taxes and property taxes together, does go up.
So we've got the 400 millionaires there that are getting 1%. They're paying 1% less than the people that are doing 250 to $1 million in total tax, right? Effective tax rate. Am I reading that correctly?
The 450 having an effective tax
Well,
rate.
you've got 450 households with more than $1 million. Their total effective tax rate with income and property. The 250, it's less than everybody.
Oh, I see. I actually am blanking on, there's a reason for that.
We should fix it.
Okay,
Either.
but I think that's the statistic, when we've heard this, it's been, well, everybody, when you do income sensitivity, everybody has to pay X percent. And what we went after in the study was, so what if those top 450 paid the same percent as as the folks at the bottom, if they had to pay 7% or 6% or whatever the number is of their income in their property taxes, then we could use that number to reduce everybody else's. I think that's how the
So, can you go back one slide? So You mean the over $1 million that are only paying 0.44% of their income in property tax?
Yeah, and everybody else is paying 3.67.
Yeah, I mean, that is,
percent. So what if we just made the top folks pay 4% of their income in taxes?
to make up the difference here.
Or, well, then you'd lower everybody else's if you put that in.
Doesn't this chart just kind of speak to that we don't have a lot of very high valued properties in Vermont that these people may or may not be living in, or just living in a house that's more modest versus,
Well, I mean, if you have $100,000 home, and you're paying, and you have, I don't know. Actually, let me start over. If you have $50,000 in income and you're paying, just totally, you're paying $10,000 in taxes. Your effective rate there is 20%. If you're making $10 million, and your house is worth $1 million, so I mean, it scales, it kind of works both ways.
Right.
It can be really high value property, but you can also at the same time be really high income.
Yeah.
And so the effective tax rate looks small, even though,
because in Vermont, we don't have those
Mansions,
big time, I'll see them on the market every now and again, several $1 million, but we don't have a ton of those properties in Vermont.
In
That-
some of our ski areas, what we're seeing more of now, I think, is people with lower incomes, not low, but comfortably middle class, whose properties have gone up in value. Just because of the recent massive inflation in the housing market. And that's where a lot of the stress is coming in, that your property value has gone up much faster than your income. Your income, as you retire, has actually gone down. And so that's where some of the stress is coming from, because we have the
Now-
third highest we're the third oldest state in the country. And we're small. I mean, 450 millionaires is not a lot of million.
Yeah, I forget, in this presentation, is there a spot that then overlays how much those over $1 million pay in income taxes and what percentage of the income tax is paid by those folks?
Well, that's you totally right.
well,
Well,
we're talking income tax. Why don't we, I'm gonna skip.
I forget
a
it.
slide here. We can come back.
We're gonna-
but
And I want to give public assets. and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So it's not based on $1 million. I have it broken out by
Yeah.
300,000 here, but that represents about 3% of Vermont taxpayers. Contributing about 42% of total. And again, this is sort of highlighting that line chart we looked at with the progressivity of the tax system. Again, I mentioned this also, those 25,000 people, their effective tax rate or their, total contribution they
Amount of money
about
they
negative
put, yeah.
1% of total collections.
Yeah.
So basically money going to these people. And on the flip side, those over 300,000.
The number I used to hear a lot was 5% pay 50% of the actual revenue that goes into the state, which is pretty close to that.
And I have one more thing I want to touch on. And that has to do with elasticity. And the reason I want to touch on that has to do with whenever income taxes or change to income taxes come up, there's this narrative of, people they leave the state in droves. And I just want to show you a couple of recent examples of what the impacts there actually ended up looking like. So California, in 2012, they actually did do, at the high income end of the spectrum, some rather significant tax increases. A 2021 paper, his name is Don Rao, I believe. I think Berkeley or Stanford, one of those two. If you were to look at sort of the static change, like if we just took the existing tax base, put these new rates on it, how much would we collect? That's sort of a static estimate, but you have to account for behavioral change, and there's sort of two different ways that can occur. One, and this is the terminology from the paper, is on the extensive margin, which is what you usually hear about people are gonna move out, they're not gonna flee these taxes. And the other is the intensive margin, which is basically they find ways to show less income. It can be delaying sales of the assets, or, you know, or other sort of ways that you can do that. And so the papers estimate in that first year compared to the static estimate that the new increases in the taxes were actually about 45% below what you would have expected. But the interesting takeaway from that is that I know there's my bullet point there. A very, very minimal portion of that had to do with people leaving. The vast majority had to do with people's how much income they were showing. So there was a strong reaction to showing less income, more so than there was to
hiding assets. I just want to go on down
America.
money
Yeah.
from my.
or you make money business or some things like that. Because you know that if you do, you're gonna show this really high income, and you know, you might increase your income through sales of certain things, but you might keep it just below that top new threshold, right? So that was an example where they set these new rates and they didn't collect as much as you might have expected. On the flip side, or you know, another example, the millionaire tax in Massachusetts, 4% starting in 2023 on all your income over $1 million. The sort of static estimate that was $2 billion. And then, so with a sort of more dynamic estimate, the Tufts Policy Center said, well, you know, people are going to change their behavior. We're estimating 1.3. They initially landed somewhere like $1.5 billion in that first year. And again, you know, the Tufts analysis found a lot of the same, or had made a lot of the same points. About 5% of revenue loss compared to the static would be from people leaving the state, with the other being you know, changing your behavior to change what your taxes look like. And so with California, that was an instance where they didn't collect as much as they might have otherwise thought they would. But I was just looking this weekend, Massachusetts in that first year collected about 2.2 billion, right? So what I just want to kind of highlight here is it can be a little uncertain whether you know, these reactions are going to be strong in one direction or the other, but they do exist and have been found with academic literature.
Massachusetts has a 5% flat tax.
Right, so this is
Usually, so they had to do this surcharge, and it was a big deal. Cause it's a constitutional,
Right.
be a constitutional amendment,
and
but that only puts them at 9. And what is it, our top
8.75.
7.5 is what I think it is. They're only like 0.25% above us right now,
Well, and our top marginal rate kicks in at a much lower.
and much lower
Yeah.
rate. Yeah, we're charging many more people a lot higher rate than Massachusetts is. So we could seek out those 450 millionaires.
You need to start taxing Mickey Mantle baseball cards.
Well, see, they just won't sell Mickey Mantle cards. Mickey Mantle cards would
Ski
stay in the ad.
And the ski show.
That's a that's a $3 million Mickey Mantle card.
Yes. Chris.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Pat. California didn't make as much as they thought they were gonna make, but they made a lot. They
Well,
brought in a
yeah,
lot,
sure.
right? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to share those
I
two
know.
examples,
Yeah.
Because that conversation always pops
That's
up when
interesting.
we talk
Yeah.
about.
Thank you for sharing those.
And California is the only, it's much bigger. I don't know if it's got better climate or not
Is
these days,
California bigger than?
but
You sure?
it has. Isn't it the one state that has a more progressive tax rate than we do?
I don't remember.
I thought California was the
Maybe.
one, maybe it's
New York.
New York.
New York has a higher one, or more progressive one. No, I knew those states were up there, we're always in the top 3, maybe California dropped when they did this. Okay,
Well, I should see if this chairs.
you should see
I know other
this.
people would like.
Yeah. And I'm, okay. Julia, yeah, I'm gonna let you go.
Okay.
Thanks. We will
See you,
get you
Julia.
back in. I think I'm gonna have Jake talk to us and then we're gonna go through Stephanie and Amy. And then, oh no, we're not gonna get a break. We might take,
We don't need a break. We're gonna charge through the.
maybe you don't need a break. The chair may take a break. Okay.
Push the 3 o'clock back to 3:15.
Ah, okay, good. All right.
Hi, everybody. Jake Feldman, Tax Department. I'm gonna go really fast, so that staff and Amy have a little bit of time. I think that there are,
I like that.
I think that there are a lot of useful things in here. So, and they get to some of the questions that you had, Madam Chair, about how many high income filers, and Senator Gulick about visibility. So I am gonna go really fast though.
Okay.
Great, good.
Okay, so big red flag on this one. No other state has or is considering an income tax to replace school property taxes on homeowners. If someone comes to the committee with a tax policy idea and it's not anything that anybody is doing, some red flags should go up. There's lots of progressive states. There are lots of states that are smart about tax policy. Sometimes they're the same states. And if they're not doing it, there could be reasons why.
So no one does it currently.
No.
No one.
Another big concept here, when people study progressivity in state tax systems, they consider all taxes together, not just one. That's kind of par for the course. Vermont has dozens of taxes and fees, and lots of them are nasty, regressive. The DMV fees are horrible. But when you think about who's paying what,
Can we clip you saying that?
oh, sorry. So when you think about
He just registered his car.
when you think about who pays, you would look at everything. And in fact, there is a study from ITEP, which Pat just referenced a few minutes ago, and Vermont is the #2 most progressive or least regressive system in the country. Should note on the ITEP study, it's a great study, but it does not include people over 65. I think if it did, Vermont would leapfrog Minnesota and we would be #1. The reason I think that is because Vermont has an $8,000 property tax credit, which mostly goes to seniors, and Minnesota's only goes up to 3,000. That's why I think that.
Just a question. No state has or is considering, has any state had a tax like this and gotten rid of it?
Not that I know of. California tried an income-based electricity charge. You should research that on your own, see what happens. If you
Electricity charge?
Yeah, trying to pay for electricity based on income. Okay, so who would pay less? The roughly 10,000 Vermonters whose home value is very high relative to their income.
Are you?
Jay would.
So
We have a break.
we take a break and.
No, we should. Keep going. Sorry, Jake.
Dinner problems. They would be psyched. If you have a big house in Charlotte, Shelburne, or Stowe, but you are on a fixed income, you love this idea. But I should say that group, that population is already getting an incredibly unusual benefit from the state through our current income sensitivity that does not exist anywhere else in the country. But yes, you would love this proposal. Who would pay less? Roughly 10,000 Vermonters whose home value is very low relative to their income. Think about mother and daughter. They both work at UVM Medical Center, cleaning rooms, $20 an hour. That's 40,000 a year for each of them, 80,000 total for the household. Live in a house that's worth like 65,000, maybe a double wide in Milton. They would be bummed by this proposal because in the current law, income sensitivity, they pay on property because it's more beneficial to them. But if you switch it to income, you force them onto a higher track. That's whose taxes would go up. That's often ignored in this conversation. Who else would pay more? Vermont's small population of high income residents. We have about 1,000 resident filers who make more than $1 million a year. Of those, only about 100 make over 1 million year after year. That's what Senator Cummings was asking about. Only about 100, yep, 10%. This is a really important little blue table here. Pat talked about Massachusetts in implementing a 4% surcharge on income over $1 million. Well, Vermont's top rate is 8.75. Massachusetts is 9. Theirs starts at 1 million. Ours starts at 275. You do a little math here and you find out that you actually have to have $13 million of income to be paying more in Massachusetts than we would in Vermont. So I'll say it again because the chair just walked in. And I am going super, super fast, but Massachusetts started this surcharge on millionaires. It's an extra 4%. So they're told their top marginal rate, you would say is 9%. Starts at $1 million of income. Vermont's top marginal rate is 8.75, but it starts around 300. So not doing particularly fancy math, but doing a little bit of math, you would need to have income of $13 million to pay more taxes in Massachusetts than you would in Vermont. But right here is a table of people with $10 million of income. And Vermont, like I'm bearing out what I just said, you're paying more in Vermont than in Massachusetts. Vermont has very few people who make $10 million a year. In Vermont, if you make a lot of money, it's a one-time event from the sale of something like your farm or your business. That's what's happening.
Okay, so California has a lot more people that,
Hollywood, Silicon Valley, yeah, it's got lots of high income people.
okay, and Hawaii.
Yep.
New Jersey's being ahead of New York. And Minnesota?
Minnesota has a very progressive tax system.
We might.
This is not about how many millionaires they have.
Yeah.
This is a chart about.
Yeah, and then.
Yeah, first, can you move that? So we can see what the title of the chart is.
Try to turn on my screen.
That just said.
Satisfying.
But what's after tax?
Oh, sorry, yeah, it says on $10 million, but I don't know how to, I don't think I can read that black box.
So that's just saying how much in each of those states you would be taxed for $10 million. It's not saying that California
Okay.
has the most people.
All right,
and then
but
Hawaii.
those are more expensive states than we are.
The title of the table matters. There you go.
Oh, that's much
No.
better.
Last one.
There.
Yeah. So yeah, and Madam Chair, in answer to your question, these days Vermont has about 1,000 people who make more than $1 million a year. Resident filers, but of those, only about 10% make it year after year after year. It's usually a one-time event. So the question is, does Vermont have more capacity at the top? I don't know, that's your call. But if there is more capacity, is this the best way to spend it on a really far out tax concept that would basically be reducing taxes for people in very valuable homes? Would this make education taxes more transparent? This is getting to your question, Senator Gulick. So right now, you go on town meeting day and there's lots of complicated things in our system, but at least 3 months later, the bill comes that shows you that the proper reflection of your vote. So that's decent.
Hopefully.
Well, here's what would happen with an education income tax. So I think at the beginning of the year, the taxpayer might need to declare their residency status, although in the bill, in my reading of it, non-residents would also be subject to this. So you might need to declare with your employer or something where you live in the state, maybe. And then in March, you'd vote on your school budget and then nothing happens. There's no reflection of it. The reason why there's no reflection of it is because withholding tables happen on a calendar year basis. The federal and state withholding tables are updated for January 1st. So we can't change what's withheld from your check, your paycheck in the middle of the year. So there's no reflection of it. And then you go more than a year later, you vote on your next school budget And then you file your taxes and you see if what you withheld or your estimated payments are enough to cover your education tax liability. This would make what you pay for education disappear, which maybe is what some people want. If you guys have seen Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark, at the end of the movie, they found the Ark, right? But they stick it in a factory, like a massive government holding thing. The Ark is just like steaming and red, but nobody's really aware of it. So that's what would be happening to what you pay for education here. A big hot steaming object.
I would say that's the most powerful
See,
explanation
you are-
I've
you are-
heard in a while.
Generally, you're
You punchy too. Like
Punch.
our punchy
Our energy is,
Yeah, this committee is always fun.
Usually you're like so subdued. Can I ask a question now? Or,
Yes.
so I hear you, but I think that one of the things that we are contemplating, depending on what happens upstairs, to see if we're contemplating it, is the foundation formula, which would not necessarily, if everybody just goes with the foundation and doesn't spend above,
Right.
there wouldn't be the same school budget process.
absolutely.
So, and also,
I had you covered
it,
with an idea.
okay, but also it doesn't, this is just, you know, the way it works now. I mean, I know April 15th it wouldn't change, but there could be changes in this process. That I don't know what's in the bill, but there could be changes. So just because that's the way it works now isn't necessarily, just to push back a little bit. There are ways to do an income tax and have it still be not buried like the Raiders of the
I
Lost.
can find your foundation formula with an income tax. You want to hear how?
No, I'm not suggesting that I'm not asking you to do it. I'm just saying that's
really
what's
easy.
contemplated.
I do, I
is
want to
that-
hear it.
It's 10 seconds, you get it.
Okay.
The ed fund, it's 25% homestead, 41% non-homestead, and then lots of other things, but sales tax, $600 million. Takes the sales tax, send it to the general fund, and send $600 million of income tax to the ed fund. And then you can find your foundation formula with an income tax.
Yeah.
And taxpayers would never know. Okay, so, but the resources.
I like it. Oh, yeah.
If you want to hear a little bit more about the administrative challenges with this, there's the first two links have some details. And if the committee keeps looking at this, we can come back in and flesh those out a
Where
bit.
can we find your report?
That's the first one.
It's linked.
Link.
No,
It's linked right
have a
there.
link.
Yeah, your
I-
PDF
The
should-
underlying thing on
Yeah,
your report is I can hit.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might have to press Control click to go to the link.
You're beyond my computer. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay.
I'm just bummed you ruined that movie for me.
Just wait a couple of years to forget what I said.
No, he's always gonna be thinking about tax policy.
Yeah.
He watches it with his kids for the first time. He's gonna be like, damn Jake film.
Okay, we're gonna move. Stephanie, you.
Thanks, Jay.
Generally. the big part of-
Spoiler alert. Well, great, it's a lot.
219,
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I will share my screen. And I will also try to be quick, because I know you're behind.
no, we actually are doing okay.
That might be dangerous if you invite me to keep talking. Okay, I'm Steph Yu, for the record, the Executive Director of Public Assets Institute. And I want to just kind of go through a couple things quickly. And I guess I'll start with saying that I want to provide our ideas to fix the income sensitivity thresholds. It's pretty straightforward, it's easy to implement, and it would provide immediate property tax relief for everyone from business. But I also want to talk about why we think income-based school taxes do make sense permanently over the long haul, and how to also kind of do it in stages in a gradual way that feels probably more reasonable than trying to do it all at once. And then I want to share some quick concerns about the plans coming from the governor and the House about the foundation system and the homestead exemption structure. But I do just want to, because the bill, I think is there's some placeholder stuff in the bill and it's not totally final. I think that there's also, I just want to say what what vision we're talking about when it comes to the income-based school taxes. Our vision has always been just for the homestead taxes, right? So all the other revenue sources would stay the same, the non-homestead, the sales tax, however you look at that. And our vision also assumed that we'd set the income rates the way we do now. So with the yield and all of those pieces, meaning that we would be starting just like we do now with what we need for school budgets. And then we're setting the rates accordingly each year. So that we're raising whatever revenue is needed to support the school budgets. So whatever volatility there is in the personal income tax wouldn't apply in the system because we'd be updating it as it works now. But I also just want to briefly talk about, we've been having a lot of community meetings. We've been invited to a lot of community meetings around the state and having conversations with Vermonters. We're hearing a lot of things about where people are on schools. And, I think it's worth saying that most people are not digging into the policy details of this to the extent that any of you are. But I think there's some consensus themes that we're hearing. So I'll go through those quickly. The first is that Vermonters do want richer Vermonters and second homeowners, whether they're Vermonters or out-of-staters, to pay more to support public education. So they don't think that middle income people should be paying a higher share of their income in school tax. The second thing is that they don't want forced consolidation and school closures. I think there's a lot of questioning, and I know this isn't sort of your area, but there's a lot of questioning about whether school consolidation saves money. And I think there's a lot of fear about losing community schools and a lot of frustrations that big towns also can sort of dictate what happens to the smaller town within the district. We're also getting that Vermonters don't want more cuts to schools, that they don't want more vouchers. They don't want to expand the use of public money in private schools. And I think the positive version of this is that Vermonters want all kids to have access to good schools, and they want to protect what they love about their local schools. So I want to jump to what we see as the two most pressing problems in education funding in Vermont. And this has come up already today quite a bit, but in our minds, the two most pressing problems are the unfairness of who pays school taxes and the cost drivers that are out of district's control. Both those that are across the board that pretty much hit all school districts in a similar way, and also those cost drivers that hit some districts much harder than others.
King, you just used the word unfairness in who pays for schools. The emails I've been getting is that second homeowners are paying for schools. Senior citizens are paying for schools, and none of us send kids to the schools. So who determines what is fair?
Well, I think that's a fair question. And I think this is our definition of what we see as the unfairness. But I will say that I think if in the Brigham decision, they're pretty specific that public education is a public good that benefits everybody, whether you have kids in school or not. Right. And that it's a collective responsibility to pay for that. So, I think that's part of the debate here. What's unfair, what's fair, what's the best way to do this? And this is sort of our assessment of what's the fair way. So
Are you advancing slides? Because
no, I'm not advancing. Okay, not yet. I'm just warming up to it.
Got it. All right.
Okay. So two most pressing problems. What we see is the ways in which who pays school taxes are unfair, and those cost drivers that don't hit school districts similarly, right? So there's the distribution of costs and the distribution of taxes are unfair and uneven. Particularly things like student mental health care or extraordinary special ed costs, in some districts harder than others. And changing the number of districts we have or having the state decide how much everyone spends don't fix either of those problems. So our main focus has always been on how we pay for schools. We've been working on education finance for more than 20 years. And I think you've all seen this before. This is, this was that one of those slides this was sort of visual of one of the slides that Patrick showed, which is that the current taxes are regressive, right? So moderate and middle income Vermonters pay a bigger share of their income in school taxes than highest income Vermonters. The second thing, which I think I talked about, again, February does feel like a long time ago, but I think we talked a little bit about the cliffs that we see in the system that cause these big jumps in tax bills from one year to the next for a lot of low and moderate income Vermonters. And this is really because the income sensitivity thresholds have gotten out of whack. So this is how it works now. The 40, and I'll run through this quickly. You can look at all the details of this plan on our site, or I'm happy to send more material if it's helpful. But that $47,000 income threshold and the $90,000 income threshold haven't been changed in decades. That $47,000 where the circuit breaker cuts out hasn't been changed since 1985. And the $90,000 hasn't been changed since 2008. So that's 17 years. So what happens is that even when school spending doesn't go up and a district budget doesn't change, a family could see this big jump from one year to the next in their tax bill because they cross one of those income thresholds. So for $1 more in income, suddenly they're paying $1,600 more in school taxes. And again, because those thresholds haven't changed and because people's property values and income keeps going up, more and more Vermonters are falling into these cliffs.
Okay, that under 47 also includes your local taxes.
Well,
It's your total property tax burden. I've tried to change that and been told that my local towns would be really angry because so you assume that in that number part, your local property taxes will go up because they will need to make up that revenue.
so this is just the school tax portion of the bill, but I will say
school tax.
But the circuit breaker is now split into two pieces, right? There's a separate.
No,
piece
it's
for the-
one, but it includes, it is your total, not above that, it's your property taxes. This, it was 35,000, includes all your property taxes, which includes your local property tax.
Right, so it's based on those pieces, but there is this cap on the municipal piece and the cap on the school piece. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I will say our proposal is to basically update those thresholds for inflation so that income sensitivity is back to where it used to be. And this is the recommendation again, so update that 47 to 60,000 by adding a step to the circuit breaker, capping it at 2.5% of income or the town income rate, whatever is lower. Updating that 90,000 for inflation to about, which would be about 130,000. And then I will say those property value thresholds also were lowered in 2018 during a lot of the tax reform process in order to get sort of more taxes out of the low and moderate income piece of this. So that's the general idea of, so this is sort of a short-term plan. This could provide immediate tax relief to FY26. I want to talk a little bit about why we think that income-based taxes make sense for the long-term sort of a permanent move. But before I do that, I just want to say, I think the yield bill that you have from the House uses about 77 million in one-time money to buy down food for everybody in FY26. And our suggestion is to use that money to target the relief toward those Vermonters paying the biggest share of their income in school taxes, which are those people facing the cliffs. So those low and moderate income people who have these, and I can we put together some matrices that sort of show the percentage that people pay at the different income levels and different property values.
Okay, that would be helpful.
Did you happen to see the governor's proposal for adjusting the income sensitivity rates and levels?
Well, I think what we're looking at from the governor's proposal and the House, and I'll get to this, is this homestead exemption approach. So starting with
Right,
property
yeah.
value and then just taking a part of the property value off and not.
Do you agree with it or?
I'll get to that a little bit, but generally we think anything that's starting with a property tax, the problem is that it perpetuates the regressivity in the current system. So once you cross whatever that threshold is, wherever the exemption phases out, you're back to this regressive tax system.
Okay, but I think what we saw was that a lot of lower income Vermonters are paying based on their property, not their income value, because their property is very low value. They might have a really nice double wide, but they depreciate very quickly. And if they have to pay based on their income, they will pay more.
So I think that there's going to be some quirks and some anomalies in any system. I think part of what, I can't remember if it was Jake or Patrick who pointed out this sort of 4% of folks, but that means 96% aren't in that boat, right? So I think it's about sort of what's an anomaly and what's really where a lot of people are. And so I think that with an income-based system, it's a fair system, it's a progressive system. Anytime we're looking at a tax policy and how progressive it is, we're looking at it based on income, based on the assumption that that income is the best measure of ability to pay. which is kind of brings me to the case we're making for income. This is what the Vermont tax structure concluded, that income is the best measure. It's not a perfect measure, right? And I completely agree with a lot of what I'm hearing today, which is that neither income nor primary home value gives you the full picture of somebody's total financial picture, right? Their net worth. And so we would be great if we could gather that information. And that might be the right interim step, right? Is to start gathering more of that information so that we do have this full picture. Because I think both Jake and I can provide examples of, what would happen to some people. But the question is, how many people are in that boat? And how much do we devise the system around where the majority of people are versus where the exceptions are? So I think that's part of the question. But I do want to just show you something else that I think is helpful. This is also something that the Tax Structure Commission did, but we did this, we updated this for more recent data. And what we're looking at here is whether primary home value gives you a good sense of people's ability to pay and how it relates to your net worth. And at the low end, your home value. So you're just looking at the home value. So the dark blue on the left is your home value. Then you've got your home value minus your mortgage. And obviously most people have a mortgage, so they don't. So I think there was a key phrase here that Patrick used, which is an asset that you own. But most people don't own their whole house. They own a part of their house, and that equity changes over time. And it changes based on how much money you put down, how far into your mortgage you are, all of those pieces. But at the bottom end, the primary home value, which is the measure here, can be 10 times your net worth. And not only that, you could have a negative net worth because you have a mortgage and other debt. And that goes up all the way through about the 80th percentile of income, which is right around that 115,000, right? So even at the 80th percentile, the primary home value is actually more than your total net worth. It's more than your worth. So what is happening there is that by using the primary home value, we're really sort of punishing those people whose primary home is their main asset, which is most people, right? So
Some of them are income sensitized.
some of them are income sensitized, right? So this is the argument for why we base so much on income, why we have income sensitivity in the first place, is that income is a better measure of somebody's ability to pay.
We have not adjusted the home value since the rise. I've tried to do that in 3 years and we've gotten distracted. But we have not increased that home value. The Senate has traditionally fought to raise that and fought to raise the income level. Because they are going up. And yes, that's out of whack at this point compared to where we were when we started.
So I think it's just worth noting that at the high end of the income scale, that's the only spot where your primary home value is actually a subset of your net worth, where it's not more than what your net worth is, right? So again, this is, there's exceptions to every rule, but this is sort of the big picture of where people land, and this is where the movement is. And then the next point I would make is that the Vermonters with the most income don't pay school taxes based on income. So we've been looking at the income of just homeowners in Vermont. And the Vermonters paying school taxes based exclusively on property. This year the breaking point is about 115,000. Some years it's 130, 125,000. But so looking at the share of income that they hold above 125,000, they hold 60% of the income for homeowners in Vermont. 13 billion, even though they're 30% of households, they hold 60% of the income. So by giving those higher income Vermonters the property option, and that is how the system works, right? You pay the lower of whichever it is. So, it's not that they're taking advantage, it's how the system is designed, that they pay the lower. But we're really letting the people with the most income off the hook on school taxes, and we're relying on those low and moderate income Vermonters to subsidize that tax rate. And as income inequality increases, we're allowing a bigger and bigger share of income not to be subject to school taxes. So,
Okay,
Can
I've got two.
I got a question on this slide.
Yeah.
You cheater.
Well, I have a question on this slide too. It's probably a non-starter, but why not keep our current system and just sort of mirror the property tax sensitivity on the high income earners and have them pay a surcharge or whatever on their income?
I think there have been plans that have looked at that in the past, which is basically at a certain point, you go from paying the lower of the two options to paying the higher of the
Yeah.
two options, which I think, is an option. I think what it doesn't do is it doesn't reduce the complexity of the system we have now, which choosing one or the other does allow you to reduce the complexity of the system we have now. And I think also part of what we want to think about here is, as long as that threshold doesn't stay fixed for 40 years, it could be a good option. If that threshold stays fixed for 40 years, then, it's going to get out of whack eventually, one way or the other.
I'm gonna write it down.
I just want to highlight one thing that represents the 60,000 households, but the number of households that are making more than $1 million is like
Small.
100. So a really small box. And so even if we tax all those, that's not going to provide that much additional revenue because there's not that many really high earning individuals in Vermont.
This would be another great piece of data to get. Like, this is one of the challenges here is, we don't have access to all this data. JFO and tax don't necessarily do this analysis every year. But the last time we looked at it, they did this analysis, which was a few years ago, I mean, 2022, somewhere in there. But the estimate was that you'd pick up about 100 million, somewhere in that range, or 100 million more from the high earners than you are now with the property tax. So again, to your point, the way the ed funding system works is that there is a shock absorber or self-balancing factor, right? So it's not that you'd raise more money, but you'd be shifting some of the cost upward. Okay. Just briefly, I mean, I think the cost drivers, you all already know this, it's been said already today that none of the governance changes or the structural changes get to the root of the cost driver problem, the healthcare, the mental health care. And so those are things that really have to get addressed, especially if you're contemplating this foundation system that goes to this one size fits all, but these costs aren't evenly distributed. And if healthcare costs keep growing faster than inflation, then a foundation amount that grows with inflation isn't going to cut it when school budgets are pretty personnel heavy, right? So I'll run through our concerns about what the proposals are coming out of the governor and the House, which is this homestead exemption model. And our main concern, again, is that it perpetuates the regressivity of the current system. Any system that starts with the property tax is going to be a regressive system. And I just want to show you a couple of kind of the visuals of what that looks like. So this is how the current system looks now. And this is so across the income values and across different percentiles of home value, this is what it looks like. So you see the big cliff in the middle, right? That's the cliff we're talking about. And then right around that 90,000 and where that income sensitivity phases out. But the proposed plan from the House, which I think I know you didn't get to the walkthrough today, but basically 95% at the really low income end, 95% of your home value is exempt from school taxes. Then it phases out at about 115,000. So that I can't remember the exact numbers, but somewhere around 110, 115. Only 10% of your value is exempt. And then and then the rest, everybody pays on 100% of their value, but it's still regressive, right? So that's the main issue. And I think, and under this homestead exemption idea, ability to pay, the best measure we have, ability to pay, which is income, is no longer the main driver of the tax bill. So, I think this question came up, are people similarly situated if they have the same income, but their primary home values are different? And our argument is that the primary home value is not a good indication because, again, it's not a liquid asset. You don't own the whole thing. Your net worth might be considered to be lower than that. And so that's a challenge. And the way it works now is everybody at the same income, if they have the same per pupil spending in their town and their income is below 90 and their home value is below 400,000, which is about 70% of the people who would get the property tax who are income sensitized now, right? They have the same bill. But under the homestead exemption plan, everybody who has an income of $80,000 about the same ability to pay, their bills would really range from about $2,000 to like $3,200, depending on where their house value is. So it's a pretty big range of bills for people with the same ability to pay. And I think the other piece of the homestead exemption plan is just, again, you're holding harmless everybody above about with the governor's plan, it's 125, with the House plan, it's 115. So you're really just shuffling the taxes around everybody under that number. So, I think income sensitivity is still a better plan than really leaning into the property tax with this homestead exemption approach. But ultimately moving to income-based taxes is the plan again for all, and instead of the homestead tax. The other piece is, I think you're talking a lot about the about the complexities of the system. It's certainly complex, and the homestead exemption really does retain all of the complexity, the complaints you get about the property tax, which is the disconnect between school tax bills and what happens, at the CLA, the disconnect between bills and school budgets, and sort of all that. And it also kind of retains the complexity of the current hybrid system, because it's based on sort of this interaction between your income and property value. So you still have to cross-reference your income, property value, CLA, exemption levels, all these things. So I know there's sort of there's a lot of decisions.
There is a lot here, and you're going very fast. You talk even faster than I do. And I think that when we find out what the House finally does,
Be a different conversation.
we're going to need to sit down and look at their funding formula, and then at a slower pace, look at alternatives. And this might well be an alternative. If if everybody agrees that the numbers are gonna work out, but I think, I know, Senator Gould, you have a.
I was just wondering if Stephanie could speak to the fact that no other states do this and why that is, even the progressive states.
I'm happy to do that. So I think there's a lot of theories around this. I think a lot of it is just historical precedent, right? I think there is this very strong association between property taxes and school taxes. You move to a town, you expect that you're paying for your schools through your property taxes. I think because Vermont has this robust income sensitivity system already, 2/3 of homeowners get some kind of income sensitized. It's not as big a leap for us as it would be for other states, but I think there is this really deep connection now, and some states don't have an income tax. So that's part of it too. A lot of states rely more heavily on property taxes than we do. And that's part of why, exactly, New Hampshire, Florida, that's part of why we have one of the least progressive, but not quite progressive, revenue systems in the country, because we have this income sensitivity. Like if you look at the ITEP report, if you break out the big three taxes, right? So income, consumption, and property, most people's property tax system is completely regressive. It looks like the sales tax slope, right? But ours doesn't, because of income sensitivity. It's more fair on the low end, but on the high end, it's still regressive. So I think you do, so I think it's more historical precedent than anything else. I think, and I think a lot of people, I think Patrick was speaking to this, that the general sense is that people want diverse taxes, right? So that if something does happen to one of the revenue systems, or one of the revenue, like we see the sales tax either, the bottom fall out during a pandemic, or it's jumped because suddenly there's, more money in the system, that you want a little bit of balance. But I think that the tax study breakdown, we did a similar exercise in terms of how much we'd be shifting from the property tax to an income tax. And I think it depends on your definition, because that study really, I believe, and this was my understanding of it, is that study treated all homestead taxes as property taxes, including those that were income sensitized. So if you treat the income sensitized taxes as already an income tax, then the shift is much lower. But either way, you still have, I think, people talk about it as a three-legged stool of the different types of taxes. So I think there's urge for diversity. But again, I think that is most states that have a less progressive tax system and are sort of moving in a progressive way, they do that through a progressive personal income tax to offset the sort of baseline regressivity in both sales and property taxes. So that was the main points I wanted to talk about. I think it's just worth saying that sort of what we keep hearing is that people want property tax relief, and they don't want to sacrifice their schools and not pursue it. So I think, how the two most pressing problems, the cost drivers and the unfairness of who pays, I don't think it's solved by a lot of these governing changes, the foundation changes and the homestead exemption. But I also think that, there's a lot of smaller steps. You can get immediate property tax relief, and you can gather more, I think, good data about what is the whole picture? How do you get a better picture of people's net worth and what makes sense? And in the meantime, updating the income sensitivity threshold, and it goes a long way for providing immediate relief for those people being hit the hardest by school projects.
Okay. I'm gonna have to wrap this one up. You might have to go back. But I'm putting off my next witnesses for 15 minutes. Many questions at this point. I think it's gonna take a while. I think I'll ask Joint Fiscal to take a look at all the charts and graphs and see if they can help us understand. What's how these interplay with ours. And maybe they have a better idea other than inertia is powerful. Why other states haven't gone to an income tax. The one part that we didn't talk about today was competitiveness. When you do the pillars of a tax code, and the reason we used to have a 5th tax rate, which was higher, and we worked to get that down because that was, even though your tax bill for most people was lower, it was that top bracket that got reported. And it was very discouraging for business or anybody because they all thought they were going to be paying a 9% tax, whatever it was, but it was in the 9s. And we pressed those two. So we have a large top tax bracket. And it is still high in the scale of things. And it does, that's the other thing that's been used to balance this is, will a company come here if all your top executives are going to have to pay twice as many taxes as they do somewhere else? And then there's New Hampshire, which is New Hampshire and California were the only 2 states that I could sell houses to people that didn't hyperventilate at the side of our property tax bills on the listing. Those are the 2 states I know that were significantly higher. Thought we were great. So
I know we have to shift gears, but it is, I mean, it puts us in a tricky place, or at least I feel like I'm in a tricky place, is because I do have constituents who feel like this will solve all our problems. And you can't have that conversation without addressing the cost drivers, which is something that you've repeated, and I really appreciate that. And at the same time, you can't address the cost drivers if we're not willing to make some changes, and people don't seem to want to change anything either. So we're in a tough spot right now. But I do want to just caution people that there is no easy fix here. And there is no like panacea that's going to make it all better. As much as that would be nice.
I hear that. And I also think more data would help. And it might take time to get that more data.
and part of it may be figuring out what data we need. And that we can use help on.
Yeah, in healthcare, sometimes we find out we have the data, but we don't have the people to interpret it, or
We don't know where it is.
we don't know where it is, or, yeah.
We are fixing healthcare, not to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I want to go to ag in the morning because we're about in the water.
Right.
I'm gonna get water. I'm gonna try, I put off our next witnesses till quarter also, I'm gonna try and get you 5-minute break.
Okay, if you want me to wait. But
Okay, Amy has,
I'll try to be.
I'm not gonna do you, but I'm feeling you don't have the same amount of technicalities, some of our.
I think, and I did submit my information
Okay.
prior. And for some reason, I can't get my screen to share. Maybe I don't have permission. There.
We have.
Now I should make sure. No.
There it is. Okay.
Okay, so I will try to be brief. I know you are running, late and you've got the folks to listen to. So in summary, I guess the greatest takeaway here is that the chamber would be more in favor of preserving and refining our existing property tax based model versus shifting to an income based model. I share this piece of data on the screen here, just as a point of context. Prior to the session, we conducted a business climate survey that asked a number of questions. When we asked, do current tax rates influence your decision to expand or invest in Vermont? 83% said yes, 17% said no. And then the second question, is Vermont's tax structure conducive to growth? 92% said no, 8% said yes. So that is the tenor that we're coming to with the business community, or I guess maybe some level
So
setting
which
for
tax are we targeting?
broad taxes. So this is broad tax.
Broad
This is
tax.
just the
Okay,
entire
yeah.
tax structure as a state.
Right, and New Hampshire's next door, so.
Yes. So shifting really to why we have this position of, refining property tax versus shifting to income tax. One being, Vermont currently already has a very high overall tax obligation. Vermont ranks third in the nation for per capita tax collections, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And if we shift and we look, why am I going that way? If we shift and we look at, that first slide was property taxes. This one is the tax summary. So we're ranked number 1 with property taxes, or ranked number 3 when it comes to the cumulative taxing per capita as of 2023 for Vermont. You've heard this before several times today, that property taxes are a stable source. The grand lists are substantially more stable than income. And then the third part that was brought up also, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, is the need to address the underlying cost drivers in education. I'll jump ahead a little bit here as well. So
Can I point out one thing before you move on? Would you mind, Chair?
No.
Right, it just seems a little, I don't know, not disingenuous, but like there's some data missing when you're pointing to like, we have the highest property tax rate without speaking to like, well, what do we get for that? Or in the second slide, what kind of services do we provide to our people? I just, it would be a fuller picture if we talked about both.
Yeah, acknowledge, but I guess I'm also sitting here looking at, representing business members at the same time that are reaching this point of inflection. I mean, we have seen businesses that can no longer operate because the economic conditions are not conducive. We have an aging workforce, we have a housing crisis that we're dealing with, but then there's also a lot of economic uncertainty. So I point those two things out really more for, this tax discussion. Let's look at the taxes that are incurred per capital,
Right.
per capita. So just acknowledging that.
Thank you.
So, if this is a continued conversation, I'll spend a little more time talking about how, income taxes won't address the causes that we're seeing in the rise of education costs. But the takeaway is, without specific strategies to manage the rising education costs, switching to an income-based model just is unlikely to ease the affordability challenges that we're already facing as Vermonters. It also would lead to greater volatility for Vermonters and for business. Income-based revenue naturally fluctuates with changes in wages, business profits, investment returns. I know it was mentioned a couple of times today that someone could be in the $1 million bracket from the sale of the business, but I also want to add some additional context to that. Often when someone sells their business, that's their 401k, that's their retirement, that's why they're selling their business. So moving to that income-based model would penalize the lifelong business owner that's trying to fund their retirement through the sale.
Or you sold the camp that your grandfather built on Joe's farm,
To your son or Prince.
or your Mickey Mouse Facebook. But something like that, and it is. I don't know how frequently, but it is. People's retirement account. It's their home is frequently their retirement account. That's what the state takes when you go on Medicaid, because you've been through your income. And the state puts a lien on your house, and your heirs may have nothing.
Thank you. Madam Chair, thank you for this. This is very helpful and I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, does the chamber have suggestions on which cost drivers we should be focusing on and how to focus on them and what to do about them or anything like that?
So today, not prepared to talk to all of the nuances, more prepared to talk to the income versus property tax issue, but I am more than happy to take a deeper dive. We're not education experts, but we do work in the healthcare side of things as well, where we do advocate on that side. Megan Sullivan from our team is a key point of contact on that, but health insurance costs, yes. So not prepared to talk about that today, but happy to be a part of the conversation as it evolves.
I think everyone should be a part of the conversation at this point, so thank you.
So just shifting back to the volatility that can happen when we move to an income tax-based system. 2 tiers here, looking at unpredictable funding and then year-to-year instability. I do apologize. I recognize that these are very small charts. I wasn't able to convert them to
home screen.
but I will describe them. So these are insights from the Pew Charitable Trust on tax revenue volatility. They were released about 3 weeks ago. So it's a recent analysis that was done that underscores the risks of shifting to an income-based model. So one, looking at revenue volatility analysis, Pew calculated both short-term and long-term volatility scores for overall state tax revenue and major tax revenue streams. And the scores are based on the year-over-year percentage changes for over 5 and 15-year periods ending in fiscal year 2023. So if you're looking at the charts, the one that is on the left side of the screen is 2015, and the one at 15 years, and the one that's on the right-hand side is 5 years. So when we look at Vermont's position in the scale, Vermont ranks 42nd in overall tax revenue volatility over the past 15 years and 33rd over the past 5 years. However,
how does your scale work? Is it good to be near 50 or bad to be?
bad to be near.
Bad to be near.
Bad to be near.
Okay, sometimes this is hard to
Yes.
grapple. All right, yeah. Sandy Cool.
Thank you, Chair Thomas. Is that, especially that second one, is that because of the makeup of our workforce and the effect that COVID had on, because the 5 years before 23, I mean, a couple of those were very, very much COVID affected.
Yeah. Well,
We're like a tourist-based, service-based state.
Yeah, everybody's. We're hit.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, some states have more industry that would probably kept chugging along to a certain extent. No,
Well, so I guess there's a give and take. So there's the 2 main drivers of our GDP are the tourism economy and manufacturing. And so tourism is generally a more volatile industry just because there are a lot of factors that go into a strong tourism economy. So COVID is one example, but flooding is another example. There can be federal impacts that are happening. So there's a lot that can change tourism on a year-to-year basis, and it is the #1 contributor to our GDP, and it's over 30,000 workers in our state. When we're looking at manufacturing, that is a lot more stable. But about 5 years ago, manufacturing used to be the #1 contributor to our GDP, and tourism was #2. So now they have swapped positions as of the recent data that we have. So just putting that out there, that there is a lot of volatility, actually, because we're a consumer-driven economy and the nature of our workforce that we have. When we look at Vermont's position, Vermont's personal income tax revenues are notably more volatile. 6th most volatile over the past 15 years and 4th over the last 5 years. That again gets to the volatility that we might have seen with natural disasters, federal impacts, and the like. Shifting now to fiscal and demographic concerns that we would have with this, relying on the volatile income tax revenue for education funding would make school budgets susceptible to economic fluctuations. So as we look at Vermont, we know that we have an aging population and a projected wave of retirements in the coming decade, and Vermont's income tax base is likely to shrink. So this contradiction, this contraction would place an increased burden on a diminishing pool of working age residents potentially undermining our ability to recruit and retain workforce essential to our economic sustainability. So there's a lot at play here that are, nuanced factors. And I think the big takeaway is that we would need to have a balanced strategy and then really looking ahead or what does make sense to me, acknowledging that there is the ed delivery and ed finance side of things. There's cost containment and how the money is raised for that. And I guess my ask would be for a thoughtful, balanced approach. And from the volatility of income taxes, it would seem that would not be a prudent path forward for our state.
Nick, I'm just gonna connect that with the last testimony. I've been to a couple of nonpartisan events with the NCLS and SLF. We've had really expert individuals that don't have a letter after their name, and they say a good state tax policy is a three-pronged stool: the property taxes, income taxes, and consumption taxes. And that's why Vermont's tax system is dependable. I think we have a reasonable approach that we should shake up. And so I think shifting entirely to income is a really big lift that I'm not sold that that's the right thing to do, because then there's ways to exploit that. So thank you for this testimony, and I appreciate considering this, but I don't see much merit in shifting away in any way with property taxes.
Probably 100%. We will look at what's being proposed for income sensitivity. We should probably look at our demographics. If we are going to have the majority of our citizens retired in a few years, we are not being very successful in stimulating housing growth, even though there's a huge demand for it. The market isn't responding, and told us because they can't build what we can afford or what national workers can afford. We need a GI Bill scale, not that bill, but something of that scale nationally, but I'm not holding my breath on that. So we are in very interesting times, which I believe is an old curse. Okay, any questions for him?
Just a few things come to mind immediately, and those are things like raising income taxes to deal with this problem is something that will be on every person's mind, every citizen's mind, every week when they look at the tax deductions of that check. It doesn't make people happy, and it will be something new. And changes that increase anything to people that are new are typically not welcome. When the focus is on dealing with people with high incomes, which a lot of the testimony that I've heard earlier today do that, those are the people who have the most flexibility and fluidity in terms of changing their residences. Those are the people who already own the second homes in Florida and so on, who can do it at the drop of a hat by just spending 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more days in Florida than they do now. And some of them already do it now. And so that is income that you wouldn't get at anyway. We count them as second homeowners as opposed to residents. And that distorts what we think of the second home market and the effect of it tremendous. We say that we have, I don't know how many people who earn over $1 million a year.
450 households.
I mean, I could count 150 right now of people who were Vermont residents who moved. And now that money that they're earning is being earned in a state that doesn't have a high income tax.
That's why they moved.
That was one of the main reasons they moved. Yes, because if they have second homes and they could spend 6 months and 1 day outside of Vermont.
Yeah.
They save a tremendous amount of money.
Right.
And that is one of the prime motivators, aside from the warm weather in the wintertime, that does that.
Yeah.
And you could rent a nice condo.
Well, they could stay in the second
Even
home
own property.
that they already own in Vermont. I mean, I can think of all kinds of reasons why this is not a good idea. And the fact that nobody else is doing it is usually.
Yes, there is an inertia focus, I'm sure there. We have our income sensitivity, my understanding, I've lost my guru that sat there, that the income sensitivity was to ensure that the majority of Vermonters paid based on their income. And we were at 75%, I think, when we started. We're down in the high 60s now. And we do need to adjust those income and housing values, especially upwards. That will do some burden. The discussion has now been, okay, you're limited to a percentage of your income, but if that top 450 households paid the same percentage of their income, then we could lower everybody else's.
So it's a balancing act. It's a question, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
But that issue, that we've heard this 1,000 times before, that balancing the kinds of taxes that we have is one of our best assurances to
Yeah.
prevent us from suddenly finding ourselves in a problem that we had the flood of a century and everything flooded and the property values went down, or we had a situation in which incomes radically changed because of recession, and those went down. All of those things, and having a balance of
Right,
taxes.
no, I agree. I'm worried about our tourism. Because of,
Tourism is going to be.
because of the
Yeah.
tariffs on Canada.
Yeah, no question.
I'm just saying.
Yep.
We need,
Great.
no, we've got one more set of witnesses and we are now 35 minutes. Over the hump.
Right.
Maybe we will have you back. This is obviously a discussion that is just getting under the way. The House hasn't, the red light hasn't gone out, so I'm assuming they haven't written a, they would probably will be, and we will maybe by tomorrow know what they've done. They may be back.
You know.
We're not.
I'm in a hurry. You guys can ask.
Okay, and this is on
If you can see what's about to trust.
the special trust, okay.
We're supposed to pop.
Yes, it's on the agenda only, and then I hope somebody.
Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Very brief on
Has a section by section.
that would be really helpful, since I'm assuming I'm going to present it. I know we can't change it or alter it, but I do need to tell what it is.
You want to try to get it nice.
Oh, yes, right, you're like,
I've always liked it.
Everyone else is gone.
anything I can't get it off, goes quickly. Like my committee told me 10 minutes ago, they didn't need a break.
And they heard what was gonna go on.
No, I guess they need a break, so we will probably be here. Yeah, let's go off live for 10 minutes.